On Tuesday, April 16th, as part of its Preaching and series, the Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence is sponsoring a workshop on preaching and conflict transformation. We have two co-leaders for the workshop. On the preaching side, we have Joni Sankin, who holds the Butler Chair in Homiletics and Biblical Interpretation at Vancouver School of Theology. On the and side, we have Regina Shan Stolfus, who is Professor of Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies at Goshen College. Thank you, too, for being here. Now, I'm sure, since you're writing this book, you might have noticed there's a little bit of conflict out there these days. There are several wars going on when we look at the international level, and we here in the U.S. have a very difficult time talking about those in a civil fashion. Our politics locally are strident, and yet here we are in another election cycle. There's racial and ethnic conflicts abounding still. Denominations are fighting over LGBTQ inclusion and ordination of women. And all of this filters down to both those sitting in the pew and those standing in the pulpit. So what in the world is a preacher to do? So, Regina, I want to start with you, if you don't mind. I've sort of in my career always talked about conflict management, but you think managing conflict is too small of a goal, it seems to me. So what do you mean by conflict transformation?
Yeah, that's such a good question. The conflict management language comes not solely, but primarily used in business settings mid-century, last century, when we were starting to get a lot of diversity in the workplace, and it was the responsibility of middle managers, right, to sort of have these people get along so that we can fulfill the mission of what our business is doing. In conflict transformation, we are hopefully acknowledging the energy that comes from conflict that can propel us into deeper relationships, more commitment to the mission of our institutions, to our communities, and to each other. And so thinking about not only the bad stuff that's involved in conflict, like we all probably agree that it doesn't feel great to be in conflict and it's a little bit scary, but to lean into the ways that we can look in history, both in large scale, but also in smaller scale in our institutions and in our communities, in the ways in which moving through a conflict can release some energy to think in new ways, to form tighter bonds with one another, to discover things that we wouldn't discover had we not had to sit down and talk about the things that really matter. And so that's where the language of conflict transformation comes from. And it's aspirational, but I also think that it's pretty descriptive of what we have seen happen in the past.
Okay, thanks. So, Joni, when I think about pastors dealing with conflict and trying to transform that in their pastoral ministry, I don't usually think about preaching. Frankly, we preachers try to avoid conflict. We want to try and preach to everybody. So can you give us a hint about in the workshop and the book that's going to follow from this, how you imagine conflict transformation being a part of the monological work of preaching?
Yes. I mean, I think what you're saying is absolutely true, that there hasn't tended to be as much focus, certainly in the literature around preaching, connected to conflict or conflict transformation. But I think the theological engine that is really driving this for me has to do with how change is connected with conflict and how the Holy Spirit can use conflict as a vehicle for sanctification. And there's this relationship that conflict brings change and change brings conflict. And if you have an integrated pastoral ministry, an integrated relationship with your congregation, no part of your ministry can really be walled off from that experience of sanctification. And so some of the things that I'm looking at exploring are around the relationship between your sermon and your congregation. Like, how do you view your relationship? How does authority work in your church? When you go to preach, do you view yourself as being kind of over against your congregation? Especially if you're being prophetic. Is a prophetic word over and against? What's the process by which you create a sermon? And I think revisiting collaborative preaching as a possibility in some contexts or for some seasons might be a possibility. Looking at the process, like how quickly do you move from like creating a sermon to preaching it? If you slow things down, it can help quite a bit. So those are some of the things that I'm exploring at this point.
So let me just ask you both a question that, as I think about this workshop coming up, and I think what might be on some preachers' minds is just how naive are you two? I mean, really, given the amount of conflict and division out there today and in the church, how much transformation can realistically be achieved in a congregation? And how much can preaching really help with that?
We've been asking ourselves the same question as we dive into the material. I mean, this is not a quick fix, but nothing worth doing is. And I think that we owe it to our congregations to not just be silenced, to be passive, to allow violence to unfold because it's not being attended to in our settings. Real change is possible, and it does happen. And we will have stories that testify to that. So it is possible, but it also is not, it's not easy. So I want to be honest about it.
Yeah. And I think that we do tend to get caught up in the emotion of the fear of conflict and the emotion of moving through it. But we can look back, again, historical record, both in our congregations, in our communities, and in the countries in the world, and see how things have changed. And so change is possible, and we want to lean into that and also lean into faith communities being faithful. If we are honest about what it is we are doing when we are being church, one of the things that we're saying is we are a people of faith, and faith means stepping into the unknown with an aspiration, with a hope, and then moving through it with the help of the Spirit, with the help of God.
Yeah. We'll also say that really small changes can make a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
It does not take a lot to kind of change the trajectory of a conflict among a community or a group of people. And I feel like it's like a parable, really. I mean, it's like the little bit of yeast and 4 measures of flour, that it does make a difference. And I think, especially as the church's relationship with broader culture continues to evolve in the West and in North America, think of our own selves as change agents, as that little bit of yeast in other settings where conflict is also present.
Well, I can't wait. Thank you, too, for joining me for this, and thank you for being willing to come to campus again. That is April 16th. If you're a preacher in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, you should make plans on being here. And if you're not in the DFW area, you should find a way to get here. I mean, after all, our presenters are coming all the way from Indiana and Canada. So you can register for the workshop on the Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence website. I hope to see you on the 16th, and I know I'll see you too. Thank you for joining.
Sounds good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.